Hi everybody, welcome to the September 11th, 2015 edition of Colorado Inside Out. I'm your host, Dominic Duzzutti. Thank you very much for joining us. Let's get a quick take on the anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. 14 years and 2 wars later, Patty Calhoun from Westward, where are we at this point?
In limbo, still in limbo. I mean, just as a good example of how in limbo we are still talking about what to do with Guantanamo. Once again, the idea of putting the prisoners from there, once it's closed, which was promised 7 years ago, putting the prisoners in Florence, Colorado has been floated. I have to say, having just driven through Hardin, Montana, which volunteered years ago to take those prisoners, that's a better place for them. You can certainly see anyone escaping for about 1,000 miles.
I would certainly agree with that point. Mike Krause, the Independence Institute, thank you for joining us. 14 years seem to go by very quickly, but we're obviously in a far different world than we were 14 years ago. Your thoughts?
You know, it's amazing. It does feel like it went by really, really quick, because I actually remember that day very well. And interestingly enough, one of the things that's happened over the last 14 years is we've started to kind of claw back from some of the initial overreach to the reaction to September 11th, which at the time nobody wanted to call overreach because they were simply reacting. And now you see Rand Paul on the floor of the Senate, debating on the Fourth Amendment with regard to the Patriot Act. You see pushback against the Department of Homeland Security, which, interestingly enough, was supposed to streamline and make more effective our response to these kind of things, and instead has become this bizarrely Byzantine and dysfunctional bureaucracy in a very short amount of time. And so what I think we're seeing now is that is some scaling back of some of the bigger overreach, while at the same time keeping in mind the fact that we need to go out and one of the things that the United States has done pretty well is to go out and proactively kill and capture outside our borders. But I think these anniversaries of September 11th are also an important time to remember that the biggest threat to the United States, the actual threat, while terrorists can kill, can murder, can cause damage, the biggest threat to our freedoms is our own reaction to these events.
Ed Sealer from the Denver Business Journal, you're our man at the Capitol, so you know the kind of politics thing. The difference in politics here in Colorado after 9/11, what stands out to you?
You know, I think there was an initial questioning of exactly what the state's role in this was, and I think you continue to hear the echoes of 9/11, and even things such as debates about the state's role in immigration policy at this point. But I think for the large part, I think people have backed off and unified around this as something that brought us together, and we need to find some way to think of our policies in the way that we thought of 9/11 as, let's put our differences aside here for just a second. Now, I mean, that really happens, of course, at the state capitol, but it seems to be an invoking of a national spirit a little bit. And I want to at least mention that I'm really glad to see that today we also have a visitor center at the site of crash of Flight 93. It's wonderful that we have gotten on top of this and really will be able to add today's views of this disaster, this tragedy, to visitors far into the future as they study this.
Long overdue. Join us for the first time on the panel, Miguel Baca-Barragon. Thank you very much for joining us from 760 AM, the Weekend Wisdom host there, so thank you. Wrap it up for us.
You know, to bring it all together, I think that when 9/11 happened 14 years ago, there was a unity that came across politically and all across the aisle, along with communities came together. I fear that maybe some of that has disappeared a little bit. There has been more home terrorism now. We're seeing things in our own neighborhood that we're not viewing as part of a falling apart of our communities again. So as we fear and we are taking, drone actions across in other parts of the world, are we really being what the Homeland Security was designed to do? And that was to bring it back at home. And what is those that are now getting ready to vote? They were only a couple years old back then. So when you're talking 14 years, that's a whole generation.
Sure. At a congressional hearing this week, EPA officials answered questions about how the Gold King mine spill has been handled. committee members asked about a video recorded at the mine while the spill was happening, pointing to a comment from a worker saying, "What do we do now?" Patty, now that comment, this was kind of odd about the video. That comment was in the original video, then omitted, and then the original video was put back on the website. So it's kind of gone back and forth, but it's really pointed to a lot of, I guess, lasting questions with what's going on with the EPA and their response to the Gold Key mine. What do you think?
Well, let's take a lesson from 9/11, which is when disasters hit, whether they're terrorist or a problem with one of our internal agencies, communication is key. So you have New Mexico not hearing about it from the EPA. You have the Navajo Nation not hearing about it from the EPA. So what do we do now? The first thing they should have done is probably notify people downstream of the spill. This is not the only funny thing with the EPA's handling afterwards and handling of its website, where first they spilled some damning photos and videos, took them off, then they put them back on, and they're going to have to keep answering to Congress. This is just the first of many, many hearings about it. But they should also be answering to Colorado here. They're talking about how a waste treatment plant there, which would be needed to clean up the water, is going to cost $20 million. We had a waste treatment plant there back in 2003 when the mine, the previous owners of the mine fell down on paying for it, so it was passed over to Stan Ennis, who now has the next mine over, and just gave him the keys to the wastewater treatment plant, which he inherited. He said, get that back up and running and save some money. So we're going to find that the EPA needs to deal with what its responses are. The EPA needs to think about what we're doing, not with just this mine and the neighboring mines, but the thousands of mines in Colorado and across the West. And Colorado Health Department is going to have to really stay on the EPA for this. I don't know if we want to put it back into the Superfund's hands.
Mike, I remember your colleague Amy Oliver Cook at the Institute, part of her Twitter feed when this happened. Imagine if this, what the reaction would be if this wasn't the EPA making all these different follows, but if it was a private company or BP or something like that. What do you think?
Let's change the initials from EPA to BP, or pick your oil and gas company or your, and imagine the response. And if you look at the EPA's, and to be honest, I mean, the EPA's response to this is somewhat reminiscent of the episode of The Simpsons where Homer inadvertently causes a meltdown at the nuclear power reactor. It's a bit like a cartoon, not quite so entertaining, certainly not for the people downstream, but This should be a learning opportunity, not just for the EPA, but for the environmental movement, who every time any private sector company that's in the business of extracting anything from the earth makes any kind of mistake, they're trashed, they're sued, they're just on them, and there is no room for mistake. And so all of a sudden you see the agency tasked with overseeing all these people all of a sudden realizing, hey, you know what? And let's assume for a minute the EPA is operating in good faith. Well, you know what? What that means is that sometimes accidents happen. And so hopefully this will be a learning opportunity, especially for the more radical version of the environmental movement who is desperately trying to deflect any blame away from the EPA for this spill, to say, hey, you know what? Sometimes things happen and sometimes people operate in good faith. And you know what? Extracting things from the earth, which is vital to our vibrant society, sometimes accidents happen.
Ed, while we're concentrating on federal officials right now and the government, all that role, I would imagine eventually this is going to become a bigger issue here locally, that the state legislature has to get involved because, as Patty pointed out, there's hundreds of mines with problems kind of like this. We have a lot of ticking bombs. This is part of our legacy here in Colorado. Do you think the legislature has the political will to tackle this next year?
Whether it has the political will or not, let me tell you what it doesn't have, and that is the money to tackle this. These are not cheap fixes here. I mean, we're talking about, Patty mentioned the water cleansing plant out there. I mean, the Post had reported that the one that operates in Idaho Springs, I believe, is about a $20 million proposal just to get it started with another $1 million a year to keep a plant like that running. The legislature may want to get involved here, but they simply don't have the funding to do this. And it's completely unrealistic. There have been some ideas thrown out there that you have to go after the mine owners. Well, some of these mine owners have been dissolved from business for 100 years now. So it's also unrealistic to think this can be something that is made up by private entities alone. I mean, this has got to be something where, shudder to think, Democrats and Republicans in the state and federal governments have to sit down and talk about this. I mean, yeah, these are obviously problems, and it's interesting to see the number of congressional Democrats that say, well, 11 times the amount that came out in this bill leak out of mines every year in Colorado. Well, hey, maybe we should do something about that then. I mean, instead of just pointing fingers, which both sides are doing very well in Congress right now, I mean, maybe this is the time to sit down and say, okay, can we come up with a plan to find funding to, if not right away, at least slowly go after them? Kind of like we go after roads and bridges. Identify the ones that have the most potential for being a problem and hit those over a 20, a 30-year period. Do I have faith that that's going to happen? Not a ton, but it would be really nice to see someone toss those ideas instead of just tossing accusations.
I can't believe you would bring that cynical point of view to this table, Ed. I mean, gosh, I mean, a little respect for the CIO table here. Miguel, what do you want to see from the EPA at this point? We've seen a variety of follies back and forth. What do you want to see from officials right now?
I'll tell you what, I have to agree with Ed. Looking at history and saying what has happened and these mine owners, okay, let's not forget, it wasn't that long ago when Ludlow occurred and the massacre down there, and that was from Roosevelt, a mine owner that was not in Colorado. So what do we have? We have owners that are probably not part of Coloradoans. Again, it's a is it in your backyard kind of issue. So when we look at our elected officials here that are representing the citizens of Colorado, where are they going to step forward and get these individuals that are responsible for this wastewater? And like Patricia said, over 100 mines that are out there that are yet to be broken into or have accidents occur, like Mike was saying, that are going to happen in our backyard, and it's going to affect not just a single portion of Coloradoans, but a large majority of Coloradoans.
Mm-hmm. In an interview with Colorado Public Radio this week, Governor John Hickenlooper said that this was not the right time to consider repealing the death penalty in Colorado. The conversation about capital punishment continues after 2 high-profile defendants were recently sentenced to life in prison. Mike, everyone's been talking about we have to have a conversation about this, but it doesn't sound like, at least right now, that the governor is going to be leading the conversation, especially if he's coming up with this statement that it's not the right time to repeal it. That's not the only part of the conversation, but right. Are you sensing it going anywhere?
You know what, there's very rarely a right time for a lot of people to talk about the death penalty. And it's interesting that 2 legislative sessions ago, a Democrat-controlled committee killed a Democrat-sponsored death penalty repeal bill. And at the time, and I believe at the time, Hickenlooper was fairly agnostic as to whether it landed on his desk or not. But they killed it because of the optics at the moment, because the theater shooting had happened. There was no verdict, there was no trial yet. And so they were concerned about the politics of the death penalty. This is not, and despite the fact that 2 juries have turned down the death penalty, it's not that difficult for one person on a jury to shut it down. I said, that said, the reason that was a bill and not a ballot measure was because the proponents of repealing the death penalty know that will not pass. And so this is not a good piece of politics, certainly not for the governor or for his party. So there's never going to be a good time politically to talk about this, although I think see it as talking about repealing death penalty is not a winner, certainly not for the Democrats at the moment.
And how we handle capital punishment in Colorado has been tweaked with before. And I remember we went to a 3-judge panel for a while, then that was ruled unconstitutional, so went back to the jury system. And the way we have a unanimous decision required is a Colorado thing. It's not necessarily a federal thing. Do you think, if not a full repeal, is there an appetite out there to at least do some tweaking to how we approach the issue?
I don't think so. I mean, because I don't know where the tweaking would go right now. I mean, it's not as if, especially because we have a 3-step process right now in putting a death penalty on somebody. So I don't think you can really make it harder in this state. I mean, I think if anything, you're going to see people saying, maybe we should cut one of these 3 steps out of the process. Maybe we should make it easier. Maybe we should, and I don't think this would fly, but maybe there'll be suggestions we go to a 9-3 verdict instead of a unanimous verdict. All in all, though, I agree with Mike that I don't I don't know that there's a huge appetite to do this right now. And I said this a couple weeks ago on the show. It's especially a tough topic at the legislature because Democrats would lead the charge on this, but one of the Democratic representatives, Rhonda Fields, her son was killed by somebody who is sitting on death row right now. So do you really want to try to overrule something that matters so personally to a fellow member of your party? That said, if we're not going to talk about it now, when are we going to talk about it? I mean, seriously, there are some things, some statements that were made after the Holmes trial that seemed to be very political. But one of them that came out was, look, if Holmes doesn't get the death penalty, who is going to get the death penalty? This is the time to say, okay, has this outlasted its usefulness? But boy, I just don't sense, especially going into an election year, that there's a lot of appetite to do that.
Miguel, everyone talks about having the conversation, yet no one's stepping up. Should someone step up, or is this a sign that really we should move on?
Well, it appears to really come in when, one, there's a case that folks are paying attention to. Usually we get national-wide coverage, then folks start talking about it. Other than that, it'll become a political issue where folks are just using it, or someone's using it to get votes or whatnot. I come back to what are we going to realize that, as Ed had mentioned, you have a gentleman that went into a movie theater with the specific intention to murder people, and to just point out, there's still the only ones on black row are African American.
So on death row.
On death row. Excuse me. Excuse me. And I made a mistake in the last one. It was excuse me. Anyway, so when it comes to those that are on death row, is it coming back to, is it a color issue? Is it where the NCAA, NCAA needs to get involved, or who's going to initiate that we need to look at those that are on death row? I had a gentleman on my show that was served 32 years on death row and was found innocent and was released. So. That's a good question. Does it need to come from a color background, or should it come from those that are being convicted, and why?
Yeah, lots of issues. Pat, wrap it up for us.
Well, it makes more sense to have a conversation about it now. Maybe not a ballot measure, but the conversation we keep talking about having, rather than waiting for something more horrific to happen that might finally get someone a death sentence. So it's a conversation that should happen in Colorado. It's not that hard. Maybe the religious leaders can lead it. Maybe some of the other people who aren't running for an office but care about this issue can do it. Certainly if Brockler does run, we will be talking about the death penalty.
The Denver Zoo plans to move forward with its plans for a waste conversion plant to convert animal waste into energy, despite complaints about potential pollution and lack of testing. And of course, as always, when it comes to talking about a load of crap, you can count on Colorado Inside Out. Ed, there's your intro. You take it from here.
There's a number of great things about this story. First of all, that we are all sitting around the table talking about elephant dung. But second, this is one of those great examples of strange bedfellows cropping up. Here you have the fight against elephant waste conversion plant. I've got to get that to feel natural coming out of my mouth. An elephant waste conversion plant being led by the neighbors of the zoo and by the Sierra Club. Now let's remember that the power that the elephant waste would replace is now coming from a coal-fired plant. So here's the Sierra Club saying, no, we want you to keep coal-fired power, not this experimental new, really renewable energy source. Look, the fact is probably there is going to be a lot of things done over the next 10 to 15 years with renewable energy sources that some of us haven't even thought of yet. We're seeing it in biomass, we're seeing it other ways. The idea of starting something like this is just common sense. If you can get rid of elephant waste this way and make it useful to the community, and I say the community in general because you're cutting down power bills for the #1 tourist attraction in all of Denver right here, I think it's a great idea. And I know people are going to have concerns, but things have got to start somewhere. So I'll be curious to see if those concerns override the potential good this can do.
Miguel, it's not like the zoo is a smelting plant here, but it's a zoo. It's a big zoo. It probably already has its own, I guess you can say, aroma. Now this might add to it or detract from it. But do you think the neighborhood has a point, or do we just need to be moving on with these better ideas for energy?
Well, the neighborhood is going to have a concern because it is in their backyard, and they are worried about what kind of things are going to be produced in the air, in the elements and the particles. But again, when we look at the zoo, we know financially they've gone into, they've hit some numbers that they aren't seeing the record numbers they used to see, even though it is, in my opinion, one of the best zoos in the nation. So for them to find an alternative way to produce power that is going to go back into the zoo, I see the neighborhood, and the zoo has always been conscious about how their animals are treated during the winter weather, during the change of seasons that we have here in Colorado. So when it comes to, and their zookeepers are trained very well. So I don't see them really wanting to do harm that's going to affect the neighborhood, when it's always been wanting to being more inclusive and inviting the neighborhood to a welcome park.
Patty, what do you think? I mean, was this going to be the case anytime something new was going to pop up at the Denver Zoo, or is there a real issue here?
Well, there's several real issues involving the parks and the zoo and this neighborhood. Sure. Let's not forget that it wasn't long ago that the zoo wanted to gobble up more of City Park, and that's one of the reasons these neighbors are very, very active in fighting this and raising a stink, not just over this plant, but they're concerned about everything the zoo does. The other thing is, this neighborhood group that's been very powerful is also going to be keeping a very close eye on the new head of parks, Happy Haynes, who was just appointed by Michael Hancock, very able public servant, but interestingly wants to keep her job, wants to continue to be on the Denver School Board. And it wasn't long ago that everyone was very upset about the trade with some parkland in Denver for a school. So this issue is going to stink much more before we're done. It's not going to be just a big pile of elephant poo that we're talking about. There's a lot more involved here.
Mike, it is your pleasure to wrap this up for us.
And as long as we're using bad puns, I have to tell you that in many ways this is just a steaming pile of green fantasy. That the idea that what the zoo really wants to do is replace cheap, affordable, and reliable energy source, coal-fired power plant, with an experimental plant that's going to depend on somebody scooping up after elephants. Not the worst place to experiment with this, the city zoo, because they're a nonprofit and a lot of their money comes from people being extracted from people who can't even afford a day at the zoo through the cultural facilities tax. So if this doesn't work, it's no skin off the zoo's teeth, of course. That said, I think that it would be fascinating if the zoo could pull this off, because I think it would be fairly groundbreaking, and we've actually seen some cities experimenting with trying to do the same thing in their city parks using dog waste to run the lights of the park. And if you could ever pull this off, you could ever get to the point where the market said, yeah, this is an effective way to do two things. One is to generate some small amount of electricity to do some specific task, like city park lights, and get rid of animal waste. I think it would be a pretty cool thing. In fact, I'd like to do it because I have 2 dogs in my backyard, and I would like nothing more than to be able to run my microwave oven 2 hours a day off the waste from my 2 dogs.
We'll keep dreaming of that day sometime. Well, now it is time for our very favorite part of the show, Disgrace of the Week. As always, Ms. Calhoun, start us off.
Well, let me just say, it's too bad we can't run the Channel 12 studio with all the crap that we let loose at this table. And I'm going to get into another kind of crappy deal right now. Yes, we all know the Denver Broncos season is about to start. And if you didn't know it, you will when your Denver Post hits your front doorstep, because there's a 76-page Denver Broncos celebration in it. And if you read the fine print in the ad, if you subscribe, and it's a number that is shrinking, to the Denver Post, the cost of that supplement will be billed against your home subscription. $3 will be taken off your subscription unless you call right away and say you don't want it. So Post subscribers, if you don't want $3 cut off your subscription, call the Post now.
Mike.
It almost sounds like the Denver Post is desperate for money. It's a bizarre thing. I have to, my disgrace of the week is Laramie County District Judge Julie Fields, who recently ruled that the Thompson School Board has to honor an expired union contract with the Thompson Education Association because they didn't approve a new contract. This is the first time in the history of Colorado that a judge has denied local control to a school board, which is guaranteed in our Constitution. Judge Fields' rationale was, I know I can't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so it's pretty, not just outrageous, it's pretty disgraceful that a judge basically told a Colorado elected school board that they cannot reject a collective bargaining agreement.
Ed.
The U.S. gives $13.4 million in aid each year to the country of Azerbaijan. I mention this because the Azerbaijan court system recently sentenced an investigative journalist over there to 7.5 years in prison for the crime of deigning to look into the finances of that country's dictator. The U.S. needs to look into the human rights abuses of some of these countries that we are helping to fund.
There you go.
Well, I'm going to bring this home, and I mean that literally. You know, with the shooting that happened this past Sunday down in lower downtown, and I live on 18th and Larimer, and the fact that we have such a large community that come down to lower downtown to enjoy themselves, and we like that. And it is a community. To look at our community in that way and just randomly start shooting out there and left and right without any care or concern, that's in my backyard, literally. And so it is a disgrace for our visitors of lower downtown to not value that it's there for tomorrow too.
It's not the Old West. See something nice about somebody? Patty.
You know, all the viewers of this show who come up to us and thank us and yell at us, but it's a great audience, and I want to also thank my parents who are watching and just celebrated their 65th wedding anniversary.
That is fantastic. I will add congratulations there to two of my very favorite people. Mike.
As it is the anniversary of September 11th, I'm going to go ahead and say something nice about the idea of people who run into burning buildings or into explosions or into natural disasters while everyone else is fleeing. Some people do it simply because it's a rush, but a lot of people do it out of a real sense of honor and community. And so to one of the largest first responder operations in the history of this country, bravo.
Ed.
I want to give a shout out to Infinite Monkey Theorem, a Denver winery that I reported this week is going to be opening the first out-of-state facility for a Colorado winery when it opens up a satellite location in Texas next month. Yeah, this is a nice little feather in the cap, but it's also a great economic boost for a wine industry that's not known nationally and could be a big help to tourism here as well.
Miguel.
And along with Mike, giving value and respect for those that we lost and the first responders, I'd like to give a good shout out for those that are in Aurora that got together to acknowledge and surround the police department at their headquarters after those awful threats, and then the religious leaders that came together to do the same. So kudos to that community.
That's all the time we have tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Remember that you can catch any part of the show or CIO postgame online, and be sure to check out the CIO podcast on iTunes. For everyone here at Channel 12, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks very much for watching. Good night.
Right now we are setting our lights for Colorado Inside Out, our Friday show. Every person around the table gets a key light, a fill light, and a backlight.
So the key light is at an angle on someone's face, and it's their main light. It gives us most of the brightness and the luminance of their face, and it's usually like at an angle, so it'd be like hitting me at this side of the angle. When you light someone with the key light, you're going to create shadows on the opposite side. So then we use a fill light to light the other side of their face. And the goal of the fill light is to be not as bright as the key, so you have a little bit of shadow, and keep it from being too flat.
Which adds up to about 1,500 watts worth of light on everybody's heads. And we're just aiming the lights for the show, making sure everything looks good.
And then the last light is the backlight, and the goal for the backlight is to create a rim around the shoulders and the head to separate the person from the background. So the backlight, when it's done right, we should have a halo or a rim light around the back of the person to separate them from the backdrop.
We've got every position around the table lit. That's 16 lights for all the people, and now we're going to light the backgrounds and the rest of the set.
We have backdrop lights, which just give us a little something in the background to keep it from being totally dark and black. One of the biggest challenges for lights here is we have people sitting really close to each other. So when you're trying to do a key and a fill on one person, we're going to get spill onto the person sitting next to them. So we have to try and work with getting the lights even and working on getting just a little bit of shadow, but not a whole lot of shadow on their face. If we get started late, we will have to just start the show, and the EIC will have to work while we're in the show, adjusting the lights and the cameras to tweak them that last couple notches to get them to look the best that they can. Kind of having funny stuff.
The fourth topic.
Welcome to the September 11th edition of Colorado Inside Postgame, a special web exclusive production here on Channel 12. Let's get a quick take on former Colorado Governor Bill Owens announcing his endorsement this week of Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush, and that he will co-chair his campaign here in Colorado. Patty Calhoun from Westward, I guess this isn't terribly surprising, but seeing that I think with the latest count 17 presidential candidates on the Republican side, is this early to hear from somebody like Bill Owens, or does he know where this is probably going?
It's early, and I guess he probably just knows Jeb Bush, felt why not. I didn't notice a huge bump in the polls from Bill Owens making this announcement. It didn't seem to push Jeb. Did it push him over 10%? I don't think so. Smartest thing Jeb did this week was go on the first episode of Stephen Colbert, where he seemed a lot more personable than he did in the last debate. We'll see how well he does on the debate coming up September 16th, which, not surprisingly, is happening on Colorado Pot Tax-Free Day. The Republican debate, free taxes.
Coincidence? We think not. Mike Krause from the Independence Institute. I guess it's not a big surprise. Governor Owens was pretty close with with President George W. Bush. But what do you think this is going to do to Colorado politics? I mean, are we still going to be talking about Donald Trump at this point, or I mean, are we that lucky to actually have him in the news cycle all the way through 2016, or is it really Jeb Bush's campaign to lose at this point?
Well, I think obviously, I think Donald Trump will stay. I mean, that's going to be an ongoing, continuous news cycle until I think until he just gets tired of doing it and moves on to the next thing, which is, I assume, is the plan. It's not just, by the way, Bill Owens who's gotten behind Jeb Bush. It's also former Colorado State Republican Chair Ryan Call is also on board with this. He's been heavily on Facebook talking about this, and it makes perfect sense. Jeb Bush is, I think you could best probably refer to Jeb Bush as pretty much like an establishment. When you're talking about the fraction to GOP in Colorado, especially, that Jeb Bush is an ideal candidate for what you might call the establishment GOP. But no, you're not. You're still going to have. There's still going to be people out there. There's still a Carly Fiorini crowd out there. There is a Donald Trump crowd out there. But Carly seems to have a pretty good crowd amongst Colorado Republicans at the moment, and so does Ted Cruz. And so I don't think this is not necessarily a Bush thing to lose in Colorado. I think we're just seeing it get warmed up. It just actually falls in very nicely into the hugely fractioned Colorado Republican Party.
Ed Sealer from the Denver Business Journal, Mike brought up how broken up the Colorado Republican Party is. Does Bill Owens still carry enough influence to at least maybe bring back a few of those groups, if not all the wings, but at least a few of them enough to create a pretty good momentum for Jeb here in Colorado?
Well, I mean, you talk about a fractured party. There are still people who are angry at Bill Owens for backing Referendum C 10 years ago. So it's
Elephants
not
have long memories.
yeah, it's not going to unite the party behind one candidate. I mean, it certainly won't hurt. Bill Owens is still one of the most recognizable Republican names out there. But I think this comes back about a month after a far less covered endorsement, which was former State Senate Minority Leader Josh Penry endorsing and saying he will be the chairman for Marco Rubio's campaign here in Colorado. Penry doesn't have as big a name as Owens does. Penry is married to a woman who runs probably Colorado's biggest Republican fundraising firm. And so I think that's going to carry with it just as much as this is. I think we'll be curious to see where some others are going to jump in now and if there are others that kind of pick up the mantle. But at least for right now, I think this defines Bush and Rubio as the two mainstream Colorado Republican candidates, and we'll see if that's going to be enough of a boost to bring their candidates up.
And new to the CIO table, Miguel Baca Barragon, thank you very much for joining us. Radio talk show host on 760 AM, Weekend Wisdom show, right, on Saturdays?
Correct.
So I think Ed brought up a great point about kind of maybe the two mainstream frontrunners in Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. Mm-hmm. When you look at Colorado Republicans, you have kind of a new school candidate, kind of an old school candidate. Where do you think the ultimate Colorado vote's going to go?
Well, with the new initiative that's out there, and let's not go wrong, we have a lot of conservatives that are also pot smokers. So when we think of how the demographics have changed in Colorado itself within the past couple of years, that's a hard line to define. I was kind of surprised that they didn't look for a minority of some sort, since our demographics are also changing within the voting population within the cities here. However, with Governor Owens, and he was a moderate governor, so he did get along with both sides. He was able to get things done that he wasn't so far right that it really offset some of the more moderate voters. So I think it was a wise decision, and I know that Governor Owens has had a long history with the Bush family, so it makes perfect sense to have someone in your corner. And I think he still holds a pretty solid name here, except for the gas and oil, anti-gas and oil people, of course. We'll see how that turns out, but I think it was a relative good idea.
That is all the time we have for Colorado Insight Postgame this week. Leave us a comment. Tell us what you think. For everyone here at Colorado Public Television and CPT12.org, I'm Dominic Dezzutti. Thanks for watching.